What if everything your people believed in, everything they built their lives around, everything they trusted for protection and provision was nothing more than a silent, powerless object standing in front of them? And only one man had the courage to say it out loud? What if speaking that truth meant standing alone against an entire nation that had normalized falsehood for generations? Before we go deeper into this powerful story, take a moment to support this journey of knowledge. Thank you for watching Islamic Insight channel. I would love to know where you are watching from, so share your country in the comments. And if you truly value content that strengthens your connection with Islam, make sure you subscribe and stay with us until the end. Because what you are about to hear is not just history, it is a pattern that continues even today. In a region known for its fertile lands and structured settlements where people lived with a sense of stability and routine, there existed a society that had gradually drifted away from the truth. This was not a sudden collapse of faith, but a slow transformation that happened over time. Generation after generation inherited beliefs without questioning them, until what was once clearly wrong began to feel completely normal. In the middle of this environment, surrounded by people who were confident in their way of life, Allah chose a man from among them, a man who knew their language, understood their customs, and saw clearly the depth of their deviation. This man was Ilyas, peace be upon him, and his role was not to blend in or remain silent, but to confront a reality that most people were no longer willing to examine. He was sent not with a complicated philosophy, but with a message that was as clear as it was uncomfortable, a message that would force people to question everything they thought they knew about their existence. The society he was sent to had built a deep attachment to something they called Baal. This was not just an object placed in a corner or a symbolic figure with minor influence. It was central to their lives. It stood tall among them, physically visible, carefully maintained, and treated with a level of importance that shaped their decisions and their priorities. People would approach it with offerings, believing that it had the ability to grant them what they needed. They looked at it as a source of security, as if their future depended on its presence. This attachment was not based on evidence or reason, but on habit, imitation, and a deeply rooted cultural acceptance that no longer required justification. When something becomes that embedded in a society, questioning it is not seen as curiosity, it is seen as rebellion. And that is exactly what happened when Ilyas began to speak. He did not approach the issue indirectly. He did not soften the truth to make it easier to accept. He asked them a question that carried within it a powerful challenge, a question that Allah preserved in the Quran. Will you call upon Baal and abandon the best of creators, Allah, your Lord, and the Lord of your forefathers? This was not just a statement. It was a confrontation with their logic. It forced them to think about something they had avoided for a long time. How could something they shaped with their own hands hold any real power over them? How could something that could not hear, could not respond, and could not even move be trusted with their hopes, their fears, and their future? His words did not introduce a new concept. The idea of worshipping Allah alone was not foreign to them. It was part of the original message given to their ancestors, but over time it had been buried under layers of distortion and neglect. Ilyas was not bringing innovation. He was restoring clarity. He was pulling back the curtain on a reality that had been ignored for too long. And that is what made his message so powerful and so dangerous at the same time. Because once the truth becomes clear, continuing to ignore it is no longer a matter of ignorance. It becomes a conscious choice. As he continued to call them, the contrast between truth and falsehood became sharper. On one side stood a prophet calling to the one who created everything, who controls life and death, who provides without limitation. On the other side stood an object that depended entirely on the people themselves for its existence. This contrast was not abstract. It was visible. It was undeniable. And yet, despite this clarity, the majority chose to hold on to what they were used to. This is the nature of human resistance when comfort is threatened. Accepting the truth would not just mean changing a belief, it would mean admitting that they had been wrong for a long time. And that kind of realization is something many people try to avoid at all costs. But Ilyas did not step back. He continued to speak with conviction, fully aware that the path of truth is rarely supported by large numbers in its early stages. He understood that his responsibility was not to force belief, but to deliver the message clearly and faithfully. Every word he spoke was rooted in certainty, and every call he made was an invitation back to something pure, something original, something that aligned with the very purpose of their creation. And even as resistance began to rise around him, even as rejection started to spread, his mission remained unchanged, because when a prophet is sent by Allah, the outcome is never measured by how many people follow, but by how faithfully the message is delivered. As the message of Ilyas continued to spread, it did not take long for it to reach the ears of those who held influence and authority over the people. These were not ordinary individuals. They were the ones who benefited most from the system that had been built around Baal. Their positions were secured by the beliefs of the people, their status reinforced by rituals that kept the population dependent, and their power strengthened by the idea that they were the guardians of tradition. So when Ilyas began to speak openly, calling people away from Baal and back to the worship of Allah alone, it was not seen as a simple disagreement. It was seen as a direct threat to everything they had built. They understood something that many others did not yet fully grasp, that if his message took root, it would not only change how people worshipped, it would dismantle the entire structure that gave them control. Their response followed a familiar pattern that has repeated itself throughout history, whenever truth challenges established falsehood. They did not engage with his message on its merits. They did not sit with the question he posed or reflect on the logic behind his words. Instead, they turned to methods that would preserve their position. They began by discrediting him, portraying him as someone who was disrupting unity, someone who was bringing division into a society that they claimed was already functioning well. They used language that sounded reasonable on the surface, but underneath it was a clear intention to protect their own interests. They reminded people of their traditions, of their ancestors, of the long history they had with Baal, as if the length of a belief somehow guaranteed its truth. And for many, this was enough. It is always easier to hold on to what is familiar than to step into something that requires change. As resistance grew, so did the isolation of Ilyas. The number of people willing to stand beside him remained small. This is one of the most difficult realities in the path of truth, that clarity does not always attract large crowds. Often, it does the opposite. It separates. It reveals who is willing to follow evidence and who is more attached to comfort. Ilyas stood firm in this reality. He did not measure his success by how many people listened, and he did not allow rejection to weaken his resolve. This is what defines the sincerity of a prophet. His responsibility is to convey, not to control outcomes. And even when faced with resistance that could easily discourage an ordinary person, he continued with the same clarity, the same strength, and the same unwavering commitment to the message he was entrusted with. The Quran honors this kind of steadfastness by placing Ilyas among the righteous, among those who fulfilled their duty regardless of the response they received. This is a powerful reminder that from the perspective of Allah, success is not tied to popularity. It is tied to obedience, to sincerity, and to the ability to remain firm when the environment becomes difficult. Ilyas embodied this completely. He did not change his message to make it more acceptable. He did not soften his words to gain approval. He spoke the truth as it was, knowing that altering it would defeat the very purpose of his mission. At the same time, his message was not only a call to abandon false worship, it was also a warning. He reminded his people that turning away from Allah is not a neutral decision. It carries consequences that unfold both in this world and in the next. This is not a threat in the sense of fear without reason. It is a reality that is built into the structure of existence. When people disconnect themselves from the one who created them, who provides for them, and who controls every aspect of their lives, they place themselves in a position of loss. Ilyas called them before that loss became visible, before it became something they could no longer deny. He warned them with a sense of urgency, but also with sincerity. His intention was not to see them punished, but to see them return. This is the nature of the prophets. They do not call people out of anger or personal gain. They call because they care about the outcome. They see what others refuse to see. They understand what is at stake, and they speak even when their words are not welcomed. Ilyas reminded his people that the blessings they enjoyed, the stability they experienced, and the provisions they relied on were not coming from Baal. They were coming from Allah alone. Ignoring that truth did not change reality. It only delayed the moment when reality would become undeniable. But as with many nations before them, the people chose to delay their response. They listened, they heard, but they did not act. Some may have felt the weight of his words. Some may have recognized the truth internally, but the pressure of society, the influence of leadership, and the comfort of routine kept them from taking that step. This is one of the most subtle, yet powerful, barriers to guidance. It is not always a lack of understanding that prevents people from accepting the truth. Sometimes it is the cost of change, the fear of standing out, the reluctance to leave behind what has always been familiar. As time passed, the message of Ilyas had been delivered with clarity. The arguments had been presented. The distinction between truth and falsehood had been made visible. At that point, the responsibility shifted. It was no longer about what they had not heard, it was about what they were choosing to ignore. And when a people reach that stage, the next phase is no longer in the hands of the messenger. It moves into the domain of divine decree, where the consequences of choices begin to unfold in ways that cannot be reversed. There comes a point in every prophetic mission when the message has been delivered so clearly, so consistently, and with such undeniable precision that nothing more can be added to it. That moment is not loud, and it does not always come with visible signs that people immediately recognize, but it marks a turning point that separates guidance from consequence. For the people of Ilyas, that moment arrived quietly, almost unnoticed by those who were too distracted by their routines and attachments to realize what had just passed them by. The truth had been placed in front of them repeatedly. The arguments had been made in ways that spoke to both reason and conscience. The contrast between what they worshipped and the one who truly controlled their existence had been laid out in terms that left no room for confusion. And yet, the majority remained unmoved. What followed was not another wave of arguments or a new approach to persuasion. There was a stillness that settled over the situation, a kind of silence that carried more weight than words ever could. It was the silence that comes after the completion of responsibility. Ilyas had done what he was sent to do. He had conveyed the message fully, without compromise, without distortion, and without holding anything back. At this stage, the matter was no longer about explanation. It became about choice. Each individual now stood with what they had heard, what they had understood, and what they were willing to accept or reject. This is a pattern that repeats across the stories of the prophets. There is always a phase of calling, followed by a phase of clarification, and then a phase where the consequences of rejection begin to take shape. For Ilyas, this shift did not mean relief in the way people might imagine. The weight of seeing people persist in a path that leads to loss is not something that disappears easily. But there is also a certainty that comes with knowing that the duty has been fulfilled. He no longer needed to push against resistance that had already revealed its nature. The truth had been made clear, and what remained was the unfolding of what had already been set in motion by the choices of the people themselves. In this phase, something else becomes evident, something that is often overlooked. The protection of the prophet is not dependent on the acceptance of the people. It is tied directly to the will of Allah. When rejection intensifies and the environment becomes hostile, Allah does not leave His messenger exposed or vulnerable. The preservation of the Prophet is part of the divine plan, not as a reward for success in numbers, but as a fulfillment of a promise that no messenger is abandoned after completing his mission. This protection does not always look the same in every story. In some cases, it is migration. In others, it is a form of rescue that removes the Prophet from the reach of those who seek to harm him. With Ilyas, what we know from authentic sources is that Allah saved him. The details are not laid out in precise terms, and that absence of detail is itself meaningful. There have been narrations outside of the most authentic sources that attempt to describe his departure in dramatic ways. But when we return to what is firmly established, we find a deliberate restraint. The Quran honors him, affirms his status among the righteous, and confirms his safety, but it doesn't indulge in specifics about how he left. This teaches an important lesson about how we approach these stories. Not every detail is necessary for guidance. Sometimes what matters is not how something happened, but what it represents. In the case of Ilyas, his protection is a clear sign that no matter how isolated a prophet may appear, no matter how strong the opposition becomes, the outcome is never controlled by the people. It is always in the hands of Allah. His disappearance from the scene left a gap that could not be filled by those who had opposed him. The same voices that once dismissed him could not replace what he represented. This is another recurring pattern. When truth leaves a place after being rejected, what remains is not stability, even if it appears that way on the surface. There is a gradual unraveling that begins to take place, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but always inevitably. The people who had once felt secure in their devotion to Baal were now left with the consequences of having turned away from clear guidance. The object they trusted had not changed. It remained exactly what it had always been, silent, unmoving, and incapable of responding. But the difference now was that the opportunity to correct their path had passed. There is something deeply striking about the absence of detailed narration regarding the final moments of Ilyas among his people. It leaves space for reflection rather than distraction. Instead of focusing on the mechanics of his departure, attention is drawn to the reality of his mission and the response it received. This is where the true weight of the story lies. A prophet stood among his people, spoke with clarity, challenged falsehood directly, and remained steadfast until his responsibility was complete. He was not overcome, he was not defeated, and he was not left at the mercy of those who rejected him. He was taken care of by the one who sent him, and this is where the story begins to echo beyond its own time. Because the disappearance of Ilyas is not just about the end of his presence among a specific group of people, it is a reminder that truth does not depend on constant visibility to remain valid. It does not need to dominate the public space to exist. It can be rejected, ignored, or even pushed aside, but it does not lose its reality. The people of Ilyas lost something far greater than they realized when they turned away from his message. They lost the direct connection to guidance that had been placed right in front of them, and by the time that loss became clear, it was no longer something they could reverse. The story leaves us with a quiet but powerful realization. The most important moments are not always the ones that come with dramatic descriptions or detailed accounts. Sometimes they are the moments that pass in silence, carrying within them the full weight of consequence. The departure of Ilyas is one of those moments. It marks the end of an opportunity, the completion of a mission, and the beginning of a reality that the people had chosen for themselves. When truth is rejected after it has been made clear, the consequences do not always arrive in a way that people immediately recognize. There is no requirement for a sudden collapse or an instant visible punishment. In many cases, the unraveling begins quietly, almost unnoticed, while people continue living as if nothing has changed. This is what makes it even more powerful, because it exposes a deeper reality. Falsehood does not need to be destroyed in a dramatic moment to prove its weakness. It carries within itself the seeds of its own failure. The people who placed their trust in Baal believed they had secured their future. They believed they had aligned themselves with something that could sustain them, protect them, and respond to their needs. But what they trusted had no control over anything. It did not create, it did not provide, and it did not even possess awareness of those who stood before it. The illusion only held as long as they refused to question it. Over time, the gap between what they believed and what was real would inevitably become impossible to ignore. The same structure that once gave them a sense of certainty would begin to reveal its emptiness. This is the nature of falsehood. It may appear stable when it is widely accepted, but its stability is borrowed from the agreement of people, not from any inherent truth. Once that agreement is tested by reality, it begins to fracture. And when it fractures, it does not leave behind anything that can support those who depended on it. The people who rejected Ilyas were not left with an alternative source of guidance. They were left with the consequences of having turned away from the only source that could truly guide them. The Quran does not always describe every detail of what happens to such people, but it establishes a principle that repeats across different nations. Those who deny the messengers after clear evidence has come to them do not escape loss. That loss may take different forms, but its outcome is the same. It strips away the illusion of control, it exposes the weakness of what they relied on, and it leaves them facing a reality they once refused to acknowledge. The tragedy is not just in the consequence itself, but in the fact that it could have been avoided. The call was there. The truth was presented. The opportunity to return was open. But it was delayed, ignored, and eventually lost. At the same time, while the outcome for those who rejected him unfolded according to divine justice, the legacy of Ilyas moved in a completely different direction. This is one of the most powerful contrasts in the stories of the prophets. On one side, you have a people who seemed strong, united, and confident in their way of life, yet their path leads to loss. On the other side, you have a single man, often standing with very few supporters, facing rejection and resistance, yet his path leads to honor and preservation. Allah does not measure success the way people do. What appears small in the moment can carry immense weight in the sight of Allah, and what appears dominant can collapse under the weight of its own false foundation. When Allah says, "Peace be upon Ilyas," it is not a simple statement. It is an elevation that places his name among those who are remembered with respect, with dignity, and with recognition that extends far beyond his time. This peace is not limited to a specific moment. It is continuous. It reflects acceptance, approval, and a status that cannot be taken away by the rejection of people. His message, his struggle, and his unwavering commitment to the truth are preserved as part of a larger narrative that continues to guide those who come after him. Even though his people turned away, his story did not end in obscurity. It became a source of reflection, a point of reference, and a reminder that sincerity and truth are never lost, even when they are not immediately embraced. There is something deeply reassuring in this for anyone who finds themselves holding on to truth in an environment that does not support it. The story of Ilyas shows that being in the minority does not diminish the value of what you stand for. It does not reduce the significance of your effort. What matters is alignment with what is true, not alignment with what is popular. This is a lesson that goes beyond history. It speaks directly to the present, to the choices people make every day, to the pressures they face, and to the internal struggle between convenience and conviction. The final part of this story leaves us with a perspective that shifts how we understand success and failure. The disappearance of Ilyas is not meant to be a mystery that distracts us with speculation. It is meant to redirect our focus toward what truly matters. His mission was completed. His responsibility was fulfilled. He stood firm when it would have been easier to step back. He spoke when silence would have been safer, and in the end, he was preserved by the one who sent him. That is the outcome that defines his story, not the details of how he left. For the people who heard him and turned away, the lesson is a warning that echoes across time. Opportunities do not remain open indefinitely. The chance to correct a path, to realign with truth, and to respond to clear guidance is something that must be taken when it is presented. Delaying that response, assuming there will always be another moment, is a risk that has cost entire nations before. And for those who hear this story now, the question is not about what happened then. It is about what is happening now. What are the things people hold on to without questioning? What are the assumptions that go unexamined? And what would it take to step back, reflect, and choose differently? The story of Ilyas does not end with his absence. It continues in every moment where truth is presented and either accepted or rejected. It continues in the choices people make when they are faced with clarity. And it continues as a reminder that in the end, what matters is not how many people stand with you, but whether you stand with the truth that Allah has made clear.